Based on the committee's investigation, it appears that Mr. Bannon had substantial advance knowledge of the plans for January 6th and likely had an important role in formulating those plans. Mr. Bannon was in the war room at the Willard on January 6th. He also appears to have detailed knowledge regarding the president's efforts to sell millions of Americans the fraud that the election was stolen. The American people are entitled to Mr. Bannon's firsthand testimony about all of these relevant facts. But as the chairman noted, Mr. Bannon is refusing to provide it. Preserving our Constitution and the rule of law is a central purpose of this investigation. The plain fact here is that Mr. Bannon has no legal right to ignore the committee's lawful subpoena.
Yes, so that was Representative Cheney delivering notes about Steve Bannon and why he's definitely implicated here. And that was taken from some time ago before the 1-6 committee. And we know that Steve Bannon has been avoiding the subpoena and responding to the point where he's now facing misdemeanor charges, having the trial scheduled to be next week. Well, of course, Steve Bannon, he decided that now it's a change of tune and he's ready to show up. That's right, to take responsibility, to go ahead and testify before the committee. Of course, he wants it to be a public testimony. Yeah, so this really says something now that Steve Bannon is willing to come forward because we know, again, Bannon has ignored the subpoena in the past in defiance of the committee to basically protect Donald Trump. So this is what we know from the media. Bannon was charged last year with 2 counts of criminal contempt of Congress. He has argued that he was free to ignore his congressional subpoena in order to protect Trump's potential privilege claims. But federal prosecutors and other legal experts have argued that privilege does not apply to Bannon, who left his White House gig as chief strategist years before the Capitol riot and did not give him the authority to refuse to provide any documents or testimony to the committee. Now, Bannon has received a letter by President Trump allowing him to waive his executive privilege, which is so incredibly interesting because multiple courts have already said executive privilege does not apply and President Trump doesn't have the power to waive that. Anyway, President Trump, of course, because he really knows no bounds, he decided to issue that letter saying that he's going to waive privilege here. That's right. So this is a tweet and picture of that letter from Hugo Lowell. That's a congressional reporter for The Guardian. He said that former Trump advisor Steve Bannon has opened discussions about appearing before the January 6th committee after the former president said in a letter dated Saturday that he would waive executive privilege over his testimony. Story coming from The Guardian. Now, the specifics of that letter would purport to allow Bannon to testify at the committee hearing. But again, executive privilege does not apply. This is what CNN said. When you first received the subpoena to testify and provide documents, I invoked the executive privilege. This is per Trump's letter. However, per Bannon's letter, excuse me. However, I watch how unfairly you and others have been treated, having to spend vast amounts of money on legal fees and all the trauma you must be going through for the love of your country. And out of respect for the office of the president, Trump wrote in a Saturday letter to Bannon, which was also obtained by CNN. Yeah, this is really something. So first off, I've got to ask you, Jessica, how does this sit with you in terms of this immediate about face from Bannon? And of course, Trump purporting to waive the executive privilege that is non-existent.
Listen, we know when Bannon was originally subpoenaed, he didn't present any of the documents that were requested of him. He didn't go on and testify or respond to the subpoena from the January 6th committee. And so what that tells us is that he's going to face criminal charges, right? He's facing those charges next week. We know that it's very likely to not go his way. And I think he's scared. And I think now he's trying to comply because as this court date approaches on July 18th, the reality that he actually might end up in a jail cell is really settling in. And Trump is like a kid playing in a schoolyard, giving himself powers that he doesn't have. Like I have the power of, executive waiver and you actually don't have to go testify. And now in the moment where Bannon probably should testify, Trump again is exercising this power he doesn't actually have, playing pretend, saying, I give you permission now. It would be the right thing to do now. And of course, Bannon's testimony is gonna be damning, but he's gonna have to sit in a deposition for hours. He's not gonna get a fancy public hearing where he gets to just go over the highlights in front of everyone. He's gonna have to sit for hours and tell everyone what happened. I don't think he knows what he's getting into.
Oh, I think Bannon knows exactly what he's doing, and that is to peddle some bull. I think that's also why he wants this public arena so that he can do it, so he can push conspiracy theories, because it's exactly what he's been doing with his trial, largely trying to confuse people to draw on those conspiracy theories. And with his trial coming up next week, where he's facing 2 misdemeanor charges, he's looking at up to 1 year in prison for each of those misdemeanor charges. And I don't necessarily know if that's a sentence he would get, some time in jail, but I damn sure know that that's what he deserves. As far as it goes in terms of his testimony before the 1-6 committee, well, California Representative Eric Swalwell, he had his own speculations about how that testimony with Bannon will likely turn out. Check this out.
Wonder what you think Steve Bannon might be able to contribute in the way of insights to that particular piece of this conversation, and what his willingness to testify now signals to you.
I can only tell you, I've interviewed Steve Bannon before. I was one of the lead investigators for the Russia prosecution for Bannon's interview. I would expect zero, absolutely nothing. This guy was like interviewing the Joker. He's maniacal, he's insane. And it was a frustrating hours-long interview where we did not learn very much. He had actually upset the Republicans. It was one of the only things that united us during the whole Russia investigation, was how much he upsetted the Republicans. He was joking around with his lawyers. They kept trying to tell him to take it seriously. I would not expect very much. I don't think, a leopard like Bannon changes its spots. And so, again, if the commission knows more than I know, that's great. They should proceed. But I would proceed very, very carefully with this guy. And by the way, Alicia, he doesn't have an executive. The president doesn't have an executive privilege to waive with Steve Bannon. Again, I think it's a power play by Trump, believing that he has, a waiver that he doesn't, and that he can release people and no one else can, including the courts. That's what I fear this is.
Absolutely, and I think that this is a coordinated effort between Trump and Bannon to get Bannon a public platform where everyone is watching and the ratings are big, to spout more lies, without a doubt. And so if the committee were to hear more details of his involvement in terms of planning the 1-6 events and the attack on the US Capitol, well, I think it should be done behind closed doors and via video. And it could be something that is possibly shown to the public, but also not. Anyways, this is also what CNN said. So the January 6th committee was interested in speaking to Bannon about his communications with Trump in December 2020, when Bannon reportedly urged him to focus on the January 6th certification of the presidential election results. Committee members were also interested in Bannon's comments in the run-up to the Capitol insurrection, including a podcast on January 5th, in which Bannon predicted all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. Bannon, who has pleaded not guilty to his contempt charges, was set to go to trial July 18th. Providing testimony would not necessarily absolve him of the criminal contempt charges he faces. So it's unclear how his upcoming trial would be affected if Bannon strikes a deal with the committee to testify. He is set to appear in court for a hearing in his case on Monday. Well, I can pretty much tell you how this would work. So we have to remember that when it comes to prosecuting cases, that's in the realm of DOJ. That's prosecutors representing the people. So it's out of Congress's hands. Once Congress said, hey, we'd like you to prosecute this, and the prosecutor said, okay, we believe there's sufficient evidence to prosecute it, it's prosecutors. So it's Merrick Garland's decision on whether to continue to prosecute this case against Bannon. It has nothing to do with whether he ends up testifying before Congress at all, whether it adheres to that subpoena or not, because he's already breached and violated it. So I think it'll be really interesting how this plays out. Jessica, do you have any final comments on this one?
Yeah, just that I hope, as Liz Cheney said, it's gonna have to be a deposition behind closed doors, hours of video footage. I hope they don't give him a platform and put him in front of the public live in one of these hearings. That would be insane. It needs to be behind the scenes, and any clips that they show from it, need to be very serious, very damning, not lies being spouted by Bannon.